Hi everyone, here is Tatiana Bazzichelli, the director of the Disruption Network Club, and I'm glad to introduce our Disruptive Friday number 32, Algorithms of Violence, Border Management, Migration and Enforced Discrimination. I'm very happy to welcome our great speakers of today. Petra Molnar, that is the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab and also the co-creator of the Migration and Technology Monitor. Then we have Martina Tazioli, that is the Reader in Politics and Technology at the Goldsmiths University of London. And Yasmine Boudiaf, that is a researcher and technologist. Behind the scenes, as usual, I want to welcome Özlem Kaya, that is our senior project manager, and thanks again the Boiling Head Media that is taking care of our streaming. These events, as you know, is also visible on YouTube for the people that are watching us there. Also, I want to remind that we have a chat, and it's possible to write questions on this chat that I will then bring towards the end to our speakers. So please use our chat that is operated by Agnese Trocchi, and I'm very happy to get your question later. And this Disruptive Friday is the second of our series that is founded by Allianz Foundation. And this series is a very important one because it's leading to our next conference that will happen at the end of March, especially the last weekend of March. The question that we are addressing today is related to, as I say, technology of violence that are in connection with the discourse of border management, migration, and enforced discrimination. And this topic is crucial also towards our March conference that will be called Smart Prisons, because there we will also discuss about prison systems, detention centers, and the new frontiers of technology in connection of this topic. So today we want to address this subject, and especially we want to ask specific questions like who gets to ask a question about proposed innovation, technological innovation, and why are perspectives from the civil society relegated to the margin. Of course, we have only 1 hour. I think there will be a lot of questions that will still need to be addressed, and that is why I also suggest the people that are watching us online to follow us in March at our conference, or even try to come to Berlin to meet directly our speakers. But I'm sure that today already we will address very important issues. And for us at the Disruption Network Lab, it's very important also to discuss on the future of technology, understands how the technology are used not to harm minority groups, and also what can we do to solve issues that arise in the usage of technology and AI, for example, itself. So we start today with Petra Molnar, that I want to welcome again. Also, Petra was with us at our conference in November 2020. So if you are interested in her work, you can also check our previous conference that was called Borders of Fear. I want to introduce Petra more in depth, and then I will leave to her to present the issues that she wants to bring to us today. So Petra Molnar is a lawyer and anthropologist specialized in technology, migration, and human rights. As I said before, she is the associate director of the Refugee Law Lab at York University and runs the Migration and Technology Monitor. At the moment, she is currently working on a first book that has the title Artificial Borders, AI, Surveillance, and Border Tech Experiments. She's also a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. So Petra, I leave the word to you, and then I will come back to introduce the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for that generous introduction, and thanks to Islam and your whole team for having me again. It's always such a wonderful conversation, and I hope that we can really unpack some of these thorny issues together today. So as you said, I'm a lawyer and an anthropologist, and I've spent the last 5 years tracking technologies of border management, surveillance, automated decision-making, and various other really high-risk projects that are playing out in migration control. So today I would like to share with you some of these reflections from the ground up and really try and unpack some of the reasons why these technologies are being used. So really throughout my years of travel from Ukraine to Kenya to US, Mexico to Greece and everywhere in between, for me the power of comparison is something very useful because it shows time and again how spaces of bordering really allow for frontier mentalities to take over, creating and innovating environments of silence and violence. But the thing is, when trying to document the system of technological oppression, it's itself a risky business, one which is fraught with trying to unravel opaque decisions, try and get a handle on the secretive private sector players that are involved, and also witnessing some of the horrific conditions which are endemic in this frontier of human migration. For me, I always ask, how does one critically document the very real human rights abuses that are inherently difficult to see? For me, as someone who sits at this sometimes uneasy intersection or mix between law and anthropology, I take a slow and trauma-informed methodology to heart. And this is something that requires years of being present in a space in order to begin unraveling some of the strands of power and privilege, story and memory that make up the spaces where people's lives unfold. And for those of you in the room who practice similar methodologies, you may also feel that sometimes we are critiqued for the way that this slow but trauma-informed methodology takes place because it often doesn't yield immediate insights. But for me, it is this slow unpicking of the real impacts of border violence that shows a lot of the power dynamics come to light. And story sharing and academic research is in and of itself a deeply political act, and it's one that I don't ever engage in lightly. We always have to be constantly reflecting and recommitting towards building a better world without violent borders. Because the thing is, borders kill. Sorry, I'm just having a trouble reconnecting to my slideshow there, but I wanted to show you some images from the border. Because already we are talking about a violent global order of exclusion and border making that is shaped and reshaped through digital technologies. We really are talking about new technologies without a regulatory framework in place. Things like AI, lie detectors, drone surveillance, sound cannons, blimps that police the skies, and even predictive analytics that make decisions and determinations about where people might be coming. The thing is, throughout every point of a person's migration journey, they might be impacted by risky, unregulated technology. And also the politics matter, right? We are talking about a world that is increasingly anti-movement and anti-migrant, defaulting to tropes of talking about people on the move in apocalyptic terms like flood or wave or crisis. So really, when trying to understand the impact of the various migration management technologies that I will be showing you, we really need to look at the ecosystem in which they develop, an ecosystem that criminalizes migration, is replete with anti-migrant sentiments, and also practices like pushbacks, which has unfortunately led to thousands of deaths at the border already. So like I said, I've been lucky because I've been able to go to a variety of border spaces throughout my work. And earlier this year in 2022, I was in the Sonora corridor between US and Mexico, because this is one of the spaces where you can actually see some of this technology play out. And here, for example, you see a lot of older surveillance technology mixed with new surveillance towers, autonomous AI-powered towers like the one you're seeing now, which is by Elbit Systems, an Israeli surveillance company. And when my team and I were in the Sonora, we were actually there at the very same time the Department of Homeland Security also announced the rollout of these robo-dogs, essentially military-grade technology, a quadruped machine that has been armed in the past, and it is now going to potentially be used for border enforcement. And the thing is, this isn't just a theoretical concern. Borders have already led to deaths. And one of the most moving experiences that we had was the ability to go into the Sonora Desert with a search and rescue group and see some of the memorial sites where people have perished, like that of Mr. Alvarado that you're seeing here. Mr. Alvarado was a young husband and father who came from Central America into the US and unfortunately passed away mere hours away from a major highway. So you can just imagine that in the future, people like Mr. Alvarado might be pursued by high-speed military-grade technology that's designed to kill. I always like to put up this picture too because I think it shows the absurdity of border walls, right? Like you can climb up this hill, for example, and see the Trump Tower. You can also touch it and get the rust on your hand, and that stays with you for the rest of your day. Then you pop up on this hill and the wall just ends, and then you stick your head into Mexico. I think we need to query what borders actually are and some of the technologies that are there and how we are actually shaping our conversations around these spaces. For the majority of the last few years, though, I've been mostly based in Greece and along the borders of Europe. And I know that this is a difficult picture to see, but I think it's an important one. This is from a small graveyard close to the village of Sidero in the Evros region in Greece. It was started by an imam in a small village and essentially is the final resting place for people who have passed away while trying to make the journey into Europe. And for me, what is one of the most affecting parts of this image are the fact that there are 3 open graves that await. When we're talking about the European space, we've really been seeing this rise of experimental surveillance technology. Frontex in particular has been a major player. That's the European border force. They've been playing around with all sorts of technology. I've already mentioned some of the other experimental tech that we've been seeing in Europe, such as long-range acoustic devices or sound cannons, and even AI lie detectors, all the while people continue to die at the border. This is one of the prison camps that have been popping up along the Aegean corridor. So there's a bunch of islands there that separate Greece and Turkey. This is the island of Kos, and I was able to go to the opening of this high-tech refugee camp, essentially an open-air prison. Kos is interestingly a site where a lot of tech experiments happen, including the EU-funded project Bro Border, which explicitly aims to create a fully functional autonomous border surveillance system with swarms of robots piloting around the island. But I would urge you to think about what better resources we could spend this money on rather than surveillance. And when I was on the island of Samos, which was one of the first camps that opened, I spoke to a young mom who was pushing her daughter on the street, and we spent a few hours together talking about how she felt about being forcibly transferred into some of these prison camps. And she quickly typed out, "If we go there, we will go crazy." And it's not hard to see why, right? We're talking about a camp that is replete with barbed wire, unfortunately something that you're seeing more and more around refugee camps, but also biometric surveillance at the turnstiles, and all sorts of even higher risk technology like using algorithmic motion detection software, and even virtual reality glasses for the guards to wear. There was an Al Jazeera investigation that really looked at this in depth if you're interested. But really, for me, I think it's important in the last few minutes of my brief remarks to just zoom out and look at some of the logics that underpin why this is happening, right? Because when we're talking about migration, we're talking about already an opaque and discretionary space of decision-making, a space where the law functions in a way that allows for experimentation, both on a policy level, but also on the technological level to occur. And as Tatiana already reminded us, it's also about bigger questions, right? When and why have we decided that these are the appropriate tools to use, particularly when we're talking about a space without adequate governance or accountability mechanisms in place when things go wrong? And so really in my work, I argue that it's this creation of these legal black holes that are deliberate, because it's deliberate to create a space of experimentation where we can then test out technologies that will be rolled out further in society. But at the end of the day, it's about politics of exclusion. It's about powerful actors like states in Europe and North America, or the so-called global north, justifying experimentation through this technological testing ground model, where then new technologies are rolled out in the form of lie detectors, drones, and other types of really high risks. And we know that a lot of these decisions are discriminatory. We know, for example, that facial recognition is discriminatory against Black and brown faces. And how can an AI lie detector deal with differences in cross-cultural communication, or the impact of trauma on memory, and the fact that people don't tell stories in a linear way? I mean, these are all questions that we have to ask. And when we see this growing border industrial complex that has really risen, and it's a multi-billion euro industry, private sector actors, particularly like Israeli companies, like we talked about with the towers and the Sonora, they stand to profit through this regulatory black hole that has been created. That's why we really need more regulation, oversight, and accountability for people who are forced to move. And at the end of the day, really, it is about some of these broader questions. Who counts? Who is a testing ground? Who is kind of a guinea pig in all of this? And why is there such little space devoted for discourse around civil society and more particularly people with lived experience of migration? Because at the end of the day, we need to recognize that the use of technology is never neutral, right? It's a political exercise, and it highlights that this allure of quick fixes and the hubris of innovation and big tech just doesn't address the systemic and historical reasons why people are marginalized and why they're forced to migrate in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. I think already you pointed very important issues that I hope we are going to discuss also more in depth during the question and answer. I'm very happy also that you will be with us at our conference Smart Prisons, because there we will speak specifically about the detention centers at borders in connection also with the usage of technology. So thank you so much for this presentation. Now I will pass the word to Martina Tazioli. She's a reader in politics and technology at Goldsmiths College, University of London. She's the author of many books, among which The Making of Migration, The Biopolitics of Mobility at Europe's Borders. And there is a forthcoming book in next year that will be Border Abolitionism, Migration Containments and Genealogies of Struggle from the Manchester University Press. Martina is also the co-editor-in-chief of Politics Journal and is on the editorial board of Political Geography Open Research. So thank you, Martina, for being with us. And now I leave the word to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tatiana, for this kind invitation. And I'm very happy to be part of this collective conversation about algorithmic violence. And I would like to start with an image. I don't know if it's possible to show. So there's an image of like automated gates that have been installed in a refugee camps in Greece. In the camp, in this case, this is a picture I took at the camp Malakasa on the Greek mainland. And these are automated gates paid by the European Commission. These automated gates requires asylum seekers to swipe their digitalized asylum card to go in and out of the camp, and also to put their finger at the gate. So only the authorized person, including like workers who work inside the camp, can go in and out, right? So these automatic gates has also been installed in other camps, in Rizona camp, although at the moment are not active yet, and also in other camps on the island. Petra mentioned Kos, but also, for instance, on the renowned camps in Samos, and they will be installed in the camp of Lesbos. So for me, this zoom on these automated gates is also an opportunity for asking what happens behind and beyond the gates, not only from a spatial point of view, so what happens inside the camp, right? But also to question this exclusive focus on technology, on the high tech, that basically the European Commission that paid, right, this technology, pay Greece to implement this technology, push us to look at. So the establishment, the enforcement of these gates has attracted a lot of like media attention, right? Many journalists have written about, and they rightly pointed to the risk, right, of enhanced surveillance and the risk for asylum seekers to be further tracked. And of course, this is a real worry. But I would like to invite you today to ask, right, what happens behind the gates if we ask this question. And why this question? Because as I said, for me, it's very important that as researchers, journalists, as people interested in this topic, as European citizens, we try not to replicate the same gaze of the European Union, or better, we try not to look precisely at what the European Union or also other policymakers and politicians invite us to look at, right? So, and for me, this requires shifting away from technology as such towards an understanding of the modes of control over refugees, in particular over refugee lives, and to situate, right, the functioning of technology as part of this broader question. So which kind of biopolitical hold over lives is exercised? And to what extent do technology enhance or transform these modes of control? So I want to suggest and hopefully discuss with you that technology strengthen refugees' perception of uncertainty more than just the perception of being surveilled, of being tracked. And they also enforce mode of governing through unevenness and discretion. So it's quite interesting that these gates, alongside other technologies like biometric system implemented in the camp, have been justified by Greek authorities as a way for better controlling refugees, but also for better protecting refugees in order to make them feeling like safer, right, inside the camp, to prevent unwanted presence in the camp. So I think it's quite interesting, this humanitarian logics that has been mobilized according to the principle of confine to protect. So, and I focus on this by I want to zoom out, right, from the gate, the automated gate, and I would like to take into account what I call an infrastructural clash. So the apparent clash, the apparently paradoxical clash, contradiction between the implementation of high-tech technologies like the gates that you have seen, implemented officially for tracking refugees and keeping them safer, right? So this also for smoothing the humanitarian logistics, while, as I will explain, is precisely the opposite. So they increase, and even as they increase, also refugees' perception of uncertainty. And on the other, the clearly misfunctioning basic humanitarian infrastructure in camps or lacking technology, right? So, and as probably some of you know, Greece since 2015 has been, as also Petra said, a sort of bad test, right, of not only of technologies, but of European migration policies. In 2015 in Greece and in Italy, the European Commission started the so-called hotspot approach. March 2016 is the month of the signature of the EU-Turkey deal that provoked like the containment of many asylum seekers on the Greek island. And most recently, June 2021, Greece declared Turkey a safe country, which implies that migrants coming from 5 countries, Somalia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Syria, and Pakistan, can be declared inadmissible to the asylum procedure, so they can be legalized preventively. And however, for me, Greece is a quite interesting case study, also not only because of this experimentation of technology, but also because of this clear, blatant infrastructural clash, in particular in refugee camps. So there is this mix, if you want, of digital and non-digital, but also misfunctioning digital technologies. And I think it's important to highlight that these misfunctioning are not simply failures, right, or glitches. And actually, they are precisely this technological disruption of asylum that underpin the daily humanitarian logistics as well as asylum procedure. So control over refugee lives is exercised precisely through unevenness and arbitrariness. For instance, at the gate, asylum seekers often cannot go out because they don't have an asylum card yet, or they lost their card, or the gates do not work. So a policeman has to intervene and decide who goes who is allowed to go inside and outside. So this drives migrants mad, right? Asylum seekers mad. So I think that this technological disruption, right, of the high tech per se should be situated in this broader infrastructural clash, which consists in, as I said, this apparent contradiction between the high tech and the misfunctioning or lack of basic humanitarian infrastructure. For instance, in the camp of Lesbos, migrants still, very often do not have electricity. Electricity often, is not there at night. So this makes the camps even unsafer, in particular for women. In many cases, also this high-tech, supposedly high-tech camp in Samos, running water was not working, right? So there are these constant breaks and shortage alongside the installation of these high-tech technologies, right? And for me, far from being a paradox, right, or a contradiction, these infrastructural clash are precisely at the core of what scholars and also journalists have defined as techno-humanitarianism. And why? Because this infrastructural clash, in the end, reproduce and enhance a protracted dependency of asylum seekers on humanitarian actors, but also the impossibility of having like a livable life, right? The impossibility of being fully dependent, right? So basically there is this reproduction of an economy of depletion and induced scarcity. So the creation of new needs that cannot be satisfied. At the same time that asylum seekers are pushed to be self-reliant, right? So they are blamed for not being independent, but actually they cannot be independent, because any time that they try to engage in autonomous activities, right, social reproduction activities. And just to give an example, in the camp of Lesbos, asylum seekers are not allowed to cook their own food in the name of security reason, because they're, as you remember, the hotspot in Lesbos was set on fire in September 2020. So this was the official justification. There might be like a fire in the camp. So there are a series of autonomous social reproduction activities that are highly hindered in camps, and any autonomous, independent space or infrastructure of livability is either criminalized or disrupted, dismantled. So I think that is important to take this infrastructural clash seriously, in order also to rethink, right, which kind of critique of border technologies do we want to articulate, even beyond an exclusive focus on tracking, surveillance, and discrimination, by starting from the way in which states, but also non-state actors, exercise and hold, right, the control over refugee lives. And so I think that a focus on Greece really help us in, zooming this out, right, in rethinking how, what do we want to do, how do we want to use our in-depth research on technologies to re-articulate a critique of the border regime. And I want to conclude just with a citation from two scholars, Brett Nilsson and Ned Rossiter, who spoke in a recent publication about the power of extracting more from less. So basically extracting values by keeping people, marginalized population, in a state of protracted dependency. And in this case, it's about optimizing humanitarian resources by providing the minimum and by reproducing protracted dependence of asylum seekers on humanitarian and state actors. So to conclude, I think infrastructural clashes in camps unfold much more the coexistence of high tech and the disruption of basic infrastructure, and they really show us that this clash is at the core of the state's hold over refugees and the attempt to disrupt and choke refugee lives, even beyond confinement, even beyond detention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martina. I think this is very important because you show that it's not just a problem of technology and innovation, but it's very much a systemic problem as well. And I mean, we are both Italian. We also know what is going on in Italy right now, specifically in connection to migration politics. So I think this is really an example of how the systems of power could also be very efficient in creating humanitarian crisis. Now I will pass to Yasmine, and I want to introduce her properly as well. She is a researcher and a creative technologist focusing on data, epistemology, and the absurd. Yasmine Boudiaf produces art project and consult on program design, strategy, and public engagement. She was named one of the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics 2022. She's a fellow at the Ada Lovelace Institute and the Royal Society of Arts, and she's engaged in research and teaching at university in UK and Sweden. So thank you, Yasmine, for being with us. Now I leave the word to you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, and thank you, Martina and Petra, for your brilliant insights. I think, I think you can hear me. Okay, great. Yeah, so I think, Martina, you took like an even more zoomed out view, and I'm going to zoom out even more and take a kind of long-term temporal view and kind of situate what has been talked about as part of a wider pattern of behavior that keeps replaying across history and geographies, but just in different forms. And I would describe this set of behaviors as part of a continuum of the subjugation of people away from power by entities of power, whether it's states or the private sector. And it's often described as, neocolonialism or white supremacy. But I want to stress the importance to avoid framings of legality and illegality and focus on harm, specifically what is the harm caused and who suffers, and try to talk about things using framings that the general public are already familiar with, and avoid falling into the trap of thinking that we require specialist knowledge in order to understand what's going on. So I'll speak about 4 mechanisms, and I will talk through a few case studies just to illustrate these mechanisms that I've noticed. So the first mechanism is criminalization. People are rendered criminal through a process of dehumanization and othering. Migrants are not criminals, they are criminalized. And this characterization is reinforced through algorithmic figuring. And to illustrate that, we can talk about IBM, which is a tech company that's over 100 years old, and it's worked with governments all around the world. During the Holocaust, it developed a proto-computer called the Holorith, where it used a punch card system to monitor the movements of minoritized groups, essentially track them for terrible things. In apartheid South Africa, they developed another kind of surveillance system called the Book of Life. Again, it was a system of policing specifically Black people. And then today, IBM offers predictive policing services to police departments all over the world, and that claims to be able to detect crime before it happens. And this is just a screenshot from a very well-produced advertisement video. There's no independent verification of whether any of this actually works, but this is essentially based on physiognomy, which is a pseudoscientific practice where assumptions are made about people's personalities based on their physical characteristics. And it's an outdated practice because you can't make conclusions about a person based on the way that they look or where they happen to be born. But we see this replaying now through the constant criminalization of migrants and in particular Black and brown bodies. I also just want to point out that physiognomy can also apply in reverse, where virtue and goodness or whiteness is assigned, again, arbitrarily. This is just an interview with a Ukrainian official who was saying, they're just like us, they have blue eyes and blonde hair and need our protection. And then governments like the UK afforded them much more protections than they do Black and brown migrants. The second mechanism is tech solutionism. And this presents particularly in times of crises where a piece of technology comes along and it's claimed that it can solve a particular problem, and it's bought in. I'll just talk about one case study, which is Palantir. During COVID, the UK government stopped having, or rather started making contracts that were not open to public tender. So they just kind of made direct contracts without public consultation. And they were taken to court and forced to show what those contracts are. And we can see here that Palantir got a contract just for £1. And so we have to think, okay, well, if if they're willing to do the service for so cheap, then it must mean that there is something really valuable in having people's data. Part of what I do is to interrogate these contracts, and we can see how much is redacted and kept away from the public. You don't need to see what's written in the contract, but you can notice what has been redacted. And they are still set to win further contracts. The next mechanism is distributed policing. And basically, pervasive surveillance technology means that borders are not necessarily geographic anymore. And also deputized law enforcement means that it's no longer just actors like border control and police who are enacting policing. It means that these roles are assigned to members of society not usually traditionally involved in law enforcement. In the UK, this set of policies is known as the hostile environment, and it puts responsibility onto people working in public services and social services to monitor people's immigration status. And these people will get in trouble if they don't report. So one example is the SEAT software used by universities to monitor students' visa status. More recently, this is a leaflet I got through my door, which uses a bit of ethnic washing, as you can see, but it's a smart meter monitoring people's gas use, and the government will help pay for some of your bills. But if you look closely at the data sharing agreements, you will see that data will be shared to third parties, including law enforcement and creditors and all sorts of things. So that's kind of what I mean by distributed policing. And the final mechanism is repurposing. So it just means when a particular technology is used for one thing that's ostensibly benevolent and then shifts to being used to something else that is potentially violent. Buddy watches are used for older people. If they fall over, then a signal is sent to their carer to say, hey, this person has fallen over, come and check on them. They had various government contracts, and the rhetoric is like telecare, elderly care, very nice. Newer contracts, this same technology has been repurposed, and they won recently a £6 million contract to place biometric watches on so-called criminal migrants to track their whereabouts while they're in the UK. So this is just the example of repurposing technology for policing and specifically targeting migrants. And I think I'm running out of time, but I wanted to try to end a bit optimistically and talk about possible interventions. As an artist and researcher, I do think that it is important to try and play around with these concepts and consider like what system of ethics and systems of care that we want to develop with our communities, rather than just giving all our power over to authorities or state actors. And it's also really important as technologists to develop tools and technologies that demonstrates, okay, what would non-violent use of tech look like? And I think that's where art and artistic interventions become really, really powerful. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Yasmine. Thanks very much. Especially, I think it's very important in your presentation to notice that what we see from technology is often a surface, because you highlighted all the systems of obfuscation and invisibility that sometimes are put in place also to acquire data. So this is very valuable, and we will have then occasion to discuss a bit more now during the question and answer. I remind the audience that it's possible to write questions on our chat that you find on our website, disruptionlab.org/Fridays, if you are watching us on YouTube. So please go on our website and find the chat and start asking questions. Now I will start with my questions. I have one for each of you, and then I will pass you the question from the audience. So we start with Petra, as we follow the line of the presentation, and I'm interested on the discourse that you were doing by stating that there serve as testing grounds for new technology because in the borders case, the regulations are limited. And could you explain a bit more in detail which role AI technology play in the development of surveillance and automation at borders, perhaps with some concrete example?
Thank you. I think this is a good question to start with because the term AI is used and overused a lot, both by the people who develop the technology and those of us who critique it. And we've been seeing this rise of all sorts of automation happen at and around the border, whether full or partial. So that's things like relying on algorithmic decision making to make determinations about visas or applications, but also other types of uses of automation when it comes to, for example, unpiloted drone surveillance technology that is being used or tested at the border for border enforcement, but also potentially for pushback or interdiction operations. That is a major, major concern. But I think, perhaps from a more philosophical perspective, the term AI in and of itself has to be critiqued because it's often used as a kind of sticker to paper over a lot of technology that just doesn't work, right? And I think that's what Martina was really reminding us. A lot of these AI type tools are kind of tech hype, solutionism, AI hype, as countries are increasingly trying to position themselves as leaders in what people have called the kind of AI arms race. And, we already talked about the kind of AI type lie detectors, which purportedly use automated facial recognition or emotion recognition to determine whether somebody might be lying or not at the border, or things like voice printing technology that purportedly determines where you are from based on your accent or dialect. I mean, they've been critiqued by technologists who really, understand the kind of nitty-gritty of how these projects work as essentially being nothing more than snake oil. And yet, that seems almost irrelevant, right? It's irrelevant that these technologies don't work because they're more used as the logic that underpins these violent regimes of exclusion, control, and bordering that really underlie the current conversations that are being had globally about who belongs and who doesn't. And that's where, again, like you started with your question, the major concern around there being such a lack of regulation is really, really key to think about because, again, this is deliberate. It's a lot easier to test out all sorts of technology, don't partially work further human rights when you don't have a regulatory or any kind of law framework in place. And, I'm a bit of a reluctant lawyer myself. Definitely the law in and of itself is also a violent project of power hierarchies that needs to be critiqued. But I think in the case where we are seeing a rollout of tech that is very harmful to people, we do need to pay particular attention to. And the last thing I will say, because this question was about AI, for those of you who are interested, in the European Union, there are a lot of conversations now being had about the proposed act to regulate artificial intelligence that is slowly winding its way through the regulatory lawmaking process. And there's a coalition of civil society groups that is putting together a coalition work really on border technologies and how the act is insufficiently thinking about the impacts of AI on people on the move. Just wanted to flag that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Petra. I have then a question for Martina. I found very interesting that you wrote that the authority justified the implementation of high-tech in refugee camps in Greece to keep track of the asylum seekers and also protect them. And I feel this discourse of protection is often very controversial because it's also justifying the existence of refugee camps, while we know instead that many people that end up in camps are basically trapped there for long and there isn't really a plan for integration. So I wanted to ask you, did the use of technology contribute to make the life of people easier, for example, in the camps that you analyze in your field works, or was it just a way to implement tracking and monitoring on minorities?
But thank you for the question. But actually, I mean, my focus, the reason why I focus on this infrastructural clash was precisely for trying to move beyond this focus on surveillance and tracking, because of course there is surveillance and tracking, and this starts since the very moment when our asylum seekers land in Europe, so their fingerprints are taken, and since then they are tracked within Europe because of the Eurodac database and the Dublin regulation. So tracking starts there, right? They start to leave the digital trace, and in some cases also much before arriving in Europe. So of course there is tracking and surveillance. But for me, if we look at the technology used in particular in the asylum system and as part of the asylum procedure, so not only for surveilling the camp, but also for processing asylum application. So for me, technology works more as a sort of like enhanced digital barriers and obstruction enforced against people who want to claim asylum. So are like infrastructural and also in some cases very low tech technologies, like or app, like I don't know. Skype was a clear barrier for asylum seeker until November 2021 to pre-register to lodge an asylum application. So there is a continuum of technologies, some of which are very low tech, if we can use this distinction, some others are more like high tech, but turn out into barriers, right, to get access to asylum and to rights in general. Then, of course, there are also technology. Then, for me, this is also the other interesting question. What is technology in refugee governance or at the border, right? Technologies like, I don't know, the prepaid cards that have been given to asylum seekers and are given to asylum seekers in Greece, in part go to asylum seekers' advantage, and there have been a lot of struggles, collective mobilization to get access to this program, EU program, funded program, to those who are excluded. But so it's not only a matter of being surveilled. So I think we really need to step out of this logic of, this techno-pessimism or techno-optimism, right? This binary opposition. But for me, the point is also to move beyond surveillance and tracking as the only lens for understanding how this technology works.
Thank you so much. Yes, I also agree with you that we have to go in depth also of understanding not only the technological aspect, but also the political and societal one, because all these systems are interconnected. And in that sense, this connects also with my question to Yasmine. You mentioned that the harm that technology can inflict on minorities because of profitable relationship between states and tech companies. And in your work, you consult on strategy and public engagement. And you also make very interesting artistic projects. So my question would be, how does art contribute to encouraging more literacy among tech experts and the civil society, to make people aware of possible bias and also risks of their activity? Maybe you can give us some examples about this through some projects that you have in mind.
Sure. It's always interesting to see people work very hard to try to understand what's going on, and operating under the assumption that in order to contribute meaningfully or participate in conversations around these sorts of technologies, they need to have a background in tech or policy or like a high level of understanding. But that's totally untrue. My work is mostly in demystifying technological concepts and to develop a conceptual understanding in people. And a basic level of understanding is enough to make a decision on what's best for you and your communities. So whether it's with so-called like experts in business or the public, I try to develop a visual language that makes concepts relatable and I try to evoke emotions rather than try to appeal to people's intellect, because it's more important to feel than to understand. Because if you feel, you have to be able to feel empathy in order to recognize injustice that is happening to people outside of your immediate self. What's really unfortunate is that startup culture and Silicon Valley, tech bro ideology has, through the empowerment of the tech lobby, has really infiltrated policy making. And it's always ridiculous to see how a lot of policymakers, including our own politicians, are completely duped and by these kind of see how gullible they are to these things. So what I found to be really powerful is to use light-hearted satire to kind of interrogate these things. So as an example, I run some workshops where we collectively interrogate these contracts. People don't have to read through the whole contracts. I just highlight in red circles where the bullshit is. And then as soon as people can see that, oh, there's a company that's won a contract for £1, it clicks. And you don't necessarily have to understand how machine learning works in order to feel that something is wrong. What's more generative is to build solidarity with other people who are also feeling the same thing, and then build resistance that way. With respect to businesses and experts and policymakers, it would be so great if they didn't behave like these kind of tech bros are like gods, because it's so embarrassing to see I think that it can go both ways.
Thank you. And I agree with you. I mean, we need also to promote literacy to make more understanding in which way also the people inside these tech companies should work to avoid bias and try to replicate these asymmetries in society. Now is the time of getting the question from the audience, and I have 3 questions so far. The first is for Petra. Do you think borders are mostly a symbolic construct? That is a very poetic question. Petra,
it's a really beautiful question. It's a really beautiful question. And I mean, for those of you who are familiar with my work, I definitely lean more towards border abolition and open border principles, while also recognizing that we are in a world where current reality perhaps also forces us to be strategic about the kind of interventions that we push for. I mean, you'll see some of the books behind me, I think, this way. Like work by Harsha Walia, for example, is really, really instructive when we're thinking about the border as a construct of violence. And, you know, I think in a way we can do both, right? We can think strategically about the kind of conversations that we're having now about regulation, governance, thinking about rules and what kind of red lines could there be when it comes to border technologies, surveillance, automation, and just, you know, technologies of violence writ large, while we can also still query really the underpinnings of why the world is the way it is and what kind of futures we are building and who continues to be excluded and why. And the border is a space that needs to be really at the center of these conversations and queried from a philosophical and an abolitionist lens as well.
Thank you. Then there is a question for Martina. Do you think that techno-humanitarianism can be compared to techno-bureaucracy? And if yes, can you see bureaucracy taking over humanitarianism, the same happening outside the technological realm?
Very interesting question. Well, I think is part of the the way in which, what I spoke before about these technological barriers, digital barriers in the asylum procedure, that of course are the result of, I can use this term, right? Techno-bureaucratic obstacles. So the bureaucracy that was already there before, of course, and it will be still there in terms of asylum system, but that is further enhanced through the implementation of technologies that makes more difficult for asylum seekers to claim asylum. So there is definitely an interesting, two interesting entangled genealogies to be made. I agree. I'm not that. I don't know if we can simply transpose right from bureaucracy to humanitarianism or the opposite, but definitely is an extremely important point also for seeing the connection with other domains, and for instance, in relation to the Greek context, to situate what's happening in the camp with what's happening in Greece, also to Greek citizens, right? And to see how these things don't pop up out of the blue. And more than seeing it in one direction or in another. For instance, in some cases, technologies in camps anticipate technologies that are used outside, but in other cases also the opposite. For instance, in Jordan, in the camp of Zatari, there is this iris scan used for identifying asylum seekers that has been reported by scholars, journalists, for the risk associated to this kind of use of biometric technology in terms of intrusiveness and privacy violation. But this system that is also used in the camp, so that basically the monthly cash assistant is uploaded on this iris scan code, right? So asylum seekers can buy their food in the camp by putting their eyes in front of a machine. Was not implemented in the camp first, was implemented in the city for Jordanian citizens years ago by a bank, Amman Cairo Bank, right? And then was also used in the camp. So I think it's important to see this interconnection, and it's not one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. Then there is a question to all, but I will pass to Yasmine. To what extent the spread of the same technologies like AI and biometrics spread the logic of borders, specifically exclusion, algorithmic state of exception to the rest of the population? Then, of course, if the others want to add something, you can do. But Yasmine, do you want to answer to this?
Yeah, sure. I think I'd be very quick, but like I spoke about before, I recognize it as a way of distributed policing, not only through the use of the technology itself, but also through deputizing border control by making other sectors of society, like the public sector and social services, act as distributed border enforcement. So those are the two kind of mechanisms that I would identify.
Thank you. And we are basically at the end of today, but if there is also comments from Petra and Martina about that, I will ask you in case you want to add something to these questions. No? Okay. There was also a funny suggestion that I will leave it as an inspiration to all. Might we look to the history of looting from some inspiration? So maybe this could be left to all of you to check. And since we are out of time, I want to thank you a lot for this very insightful conversation, and all your answers that were very important and right to the topic. And I hope that we will have occasion to invite you again at the Disruption Lab and keep on working on these topics together. So thank you very much, Petra, Yasmine, and Martina. And now I will just do two announcements for our closing in relationship to the next things that will happen at the Disruption Network Club. So for sure, one is our conference that I just mentioned before, Smart Prisons, that will happen at the end of March, is the last weekend of March. And in that context, we will go on with specifically this discussion. There will be, of course, also the focus on technology due to the title, but we will also look on the impact of technology and especially smart technology on detention centers at borders. So again, in connection with migration, and also on the new generation of prison systems that is also using AI and tracking and monitoring technology. So I also suggest you to go check the previous Disruptive Friday that we had in this context. Was at the beginning of November with Sean Veghezzi and Fiamma Montezemolo, in which we specifically also spoke on prison systems and human rights and the form of technology that are used for investigating prisons and also opening up the concept of prisons. You can find it on our website, again, at the disruptionlab.org/Fridays. And the next project that I'm going to mention is a new Disruptive Friday that we will have on December 16 at 4. And is defeating gender inequality as part of an exchange project with the Regional Development Hub Caucasus in Georgia that has been our partner now for 3 years. This project is specifically focusing on gender justice and is developed to raise awareness and define possible effective strategies to implement in Georgia. And in this discussion, we will try to find concrete solutions against gender inequality and will be presented through research, through literature, and having a discussion again with our public. This specific project is funded by the German Federal Foreign Office, so I suggest you to follow us on December 16, again online, when we will have this conversation about defeating gender inequality in Georgia and Germany. And finally, since we are in time of Christmas presents and nice, donation to give, I remind you that finally we have our membership card development here. That is a 1-year membership card that we are offering to our audience for only €50. And this gives the possibility to have free access to all our conferences, our meetups and workshops during the whole year of 2023. Also, you will get 50% discount on the tickets for your friends and early invites to all our events. And if you are a full-time student, you are unemployed or are receiving benefits or are retired, the card is only €25. So you can check everything on our webpage that is dedicated to the memberships. And if you want to give a Christmas present to all your friends, now you know what to do. And so again, thank you very much to our wonderful speakers. And we will see again online the 16th of December. Otherwise, for the people that are interested on this subject, in Berlin in March at Kunstquartier Bethanien and at our conference Smart Prison. So thank you for being with us. Thank to all the audience and our wonderful speakers of today.